Meet Berries, the AI-powered scribe that writes your therapy notes for you. Secure and private with no recording stored and EMR ready with one click. Join over 8,000 clinicians, saving time and staying present in sessions. And right now, save $50 off your first month with code TherapyShow50. Berries, so you can focus on care, not notes.
Welcome to the Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard, where continuing education meets convenience. Lisa brings therapists practical conversations with expert guests who share tools, techniques, and insights to enrich your practice. Whether you're on a walk, commuting, or cooking dinner, you can earn continuing education contact hours and stay inspired without sitting through endless recorded trainings. Visit lisamustard.com to join the CE membership and keep your professional growth as seamless as your favorite podcast.
Please note that the content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional mental health care, diagnose, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own licensed mental health provider or medical professional regarding your specific situation. While I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and my guests are also professional counselors, the discussions in this podcast are meant to offer general insights and should not be taken as personalized therapeutic advice. Listening to this podcast does not establish a therapist-client relationship with me or any of my guests. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis or have thoughts of harming yourself or others, please contact a mental health professional, call 911, or go to the nearest emergency room immediately. You can also reach out to a crisis hotline such as the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 in the United States for immediate support. Every individual's journey is unique, and what works for one person may not be suitable for another, so please use discretion and seek appropriate care as needed. Well, hey friends, welcome back to another episode of The Therapy Show. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard, and this week's episode is a Podcourse, which means it does qualify for one continuing education contact hour. And my company, Mustard Consulting LLC, is a NBCC approved provider. I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Stuhlreyer to the podcast. Steve, it's great to have you. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Would you give our audience a little bit of your background, who you are, what you do, and how you help?
Yeah. Again, thanks for the opportunity. So I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I currently do several things professionally, one of which is I'm a professor of counselor education at Columbia International University. In that role, I teach in the master's programs, various classes, research. I'm one of the few counselors that enjoy research and they enjoy teaching it. So I teach that. I teach psychopathology and teach some of the other classes that are, if anybody's gone through a master's in counseling program, you'd recognize foundations and whatnot. I also teach in the PhD program at Columbia International University and serve as the director of the PhD program. So I teach mainly in the PhD program, I teach mainly the research line, research theory and quantitative research methods and dissertation proposals. So all those things that students don't want to do when they get into the program, I get to teach. But we have a lot of fun. Research is fun and important. In addition to that, I also lead my own private practice here in Cincinnati and have since 2012, where I primarily at this point in time see men in counseling. I also see couples as well. And so get to work with a lot of men there as well. I also get to lead a retreat for men twice a year. Up here in Ohio, we get about 200 men from all over the Midwest to come to that. All also married, just had 25 years of, just passed their 25th anniversary, 3 young adult kids, and somehow they've survived my fathering.
Well, that is a milestone. Congratulations on your anniversary and raising 3 competent, healthy, smart, contributing to society kids. Those both are accomplishments in themselves. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Are you an Ohio State fan?
I am because I have to be. You know, there are outside the professional Cincinnati Bengals team. You know, the University of Cincinnati doesn't have much of a football team right now, so you have to root for Ohio State, especially when they play against Michigan at the end of the year.
Yeah, and being that they are doing really well, I had to ask.
Right.
We are Clemson fans first, Carolina fans second, and Georgia fans third. So we might see you, Ohio State, at the national playoffs.
Well, we might. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about how therapists work with men. So where would you like to start?
I'd like to start in the area of how did I start counseling men? I really because I think this provides context for us, and then it provides context for some of the other interests I have in research with men or even pastors that I do some research around. So I'll spend a minute or two on that, if that's okay. I really never intended to really work with men solely. And as I said earlier, I work with men. I also work with couples. So I got in the field and didn't have a niche, so to speak, of who I was going to work with, and worked with, kids who've been sexually traumatized. I worked with ladies who'd been sexually traumatized as kids. Now they're adult women. Worked a lot around substance abuse and really, and as previous to starting my practice, I worked in community mental health. And so we generally just saw whoever came through the door. So I had a lot of exposure to various diagnoses and life struggles and whatnot. So eventually, as I opened up my practice, probably in order to just kind of survive financially in the business, and just try to see whomever could come in. And over time, again, my initial intention was really never just to sit down and see men. It was to see whoever could come to the door. But the more and more that I did this work, as time went by, the more and more men either came into my office for counseling with their spouse, or they would call me and set up an appointment and come in and make comments to me of, I can't find any male therapists in the Cincinnati area. I'm glad I found you. And then we would work together on various topics, whatever they needed. And so I began to see more and more men that way. So I never really intentionally reached out to market myself to men. It just kind of happened. And as I was working with men, I began to hear more and more themes, across many of the clients that I saw over the months and years, eventually years. And those themes were around men were really lonely, incredibly lonely men, because of their loneliness, maybe some other things. They tended to turn to things that brought what I call pseudo fulfillment, which is, it's a short-term, temporary, like for example, pornography. The turn to pornography is like short-term fulfillment, and then it's over with, and then they're lonely again. So a lot of men began to disclose to me, just almost on a whim, oh yeah, I use pornography a little bit here or a lot here, or I'm really lonely in my marriage. I've never told anybody, or I have a sexless marriage and I've never told anybody about this. And so I found it to be kind of useful, if you will, for the guys to be able to come in and sit with another guy and just connect. And not that female counselors can't connect with the men, but in some cases, I think there's some wisdom and value in a man connecting to a man, which is a little bit what we're going to talk about today, a man connecting to a man. And I know a little bit of what it's like to be a man in our society, because I am one. And so there are certain things I can say or do, or experiences I've had that I can share with the guys that help them connect to us. And so that's how I got started working with men. And really along the way, I wish I had been smart enough to figure out how to navigate this process to build a private practice. I effectively just began to see whoever came through the door. And eventually I began, again, once I started seeing a lot of men and couples, heterosexual couples, I began to just really limit who I was going to see at that point. This is about 3 years ago, when my caseload got to the place where I decided I was not going to see ladies one-on-one, primarily because I wanted to keep those slots open for the guys, and I'd see the couples as well. So that's how I got here. And now the research around men that I'm engaging in and the writing I'm doing, research or talk in the professional literature about men's ministry. Not that there isn't any, but relatively speaking, there's not a whole lot there.
Okay, gotcha. I know we have 4 learning objectives that we're going to cover today. The first one is analyze the unique factors that influence men's mental health needs across different contexts. Where would you like to start that first?
Yeah, well, let's start there. There's some unique things to men, of course. Some of the unique contributions to men and their mental health really fall into this almost contradictory experience that men have in our culture and our society. And And I want to qualify a lot of what I'm about to say by saying it's not that ladies don't also have some contradictory messages sent to them in our culture. Men experience it in a pretty unique kind of way. And we'll talk about some evidence-based approaches to address some of these things. And I think I'll get into it a little more deeply there. And so some of the uniqueness of what men experience revolves around these contradictory messages and that they have learned from our culture or learned from their upbringing or learned from other boys or whatnot. And some of those messages revolve around, number one, you have to be men have to be successful at everything that they do. And secondly, our culture really sends the message that men are generally incompetent and they're buffoons and they can't. And I'll talk about where we see this in a minute. And they should not they really should not really assert themselves in communication or in relationships. And when I say asserting themselves, I don't mean men should be bullies or tyrants or anything like that whatsoever. And I don't want people to misunderstand that. What I'm talking about, men asserting themselves, is being able to speak up and say, no, that I don't like that, or no, this is what I think about this particular situation. And so men are inadvertently, in some cases, but in some cases very intentionally, receive a message that's communicated to them that they are just to be quiet, stand to the side, and let other people lead. Because if you try to lead, if you try to be who you are and assert yourself, you're displaying what people have called several years ago toxic masculinity. And in my opinion, that was not a helpful phrase to just blanketly put on all the men. So that's a unique message. Men are told they have to succeed at everything, yet you can't really assert yourself. And so consequently, what happens a lot to men is they tend to withdraw so they can stay out of situations that generate conflict in their relationships and in the community that they're in. A lot of men that I see in counseling tell me either directly or over time just how afraid they are of conflict. And so they avoid conflict at all costs. A lot of men, not all men, will avoid conflict at all costs. And that ultimately has a long-term negative effect on them. If any person can't just communicate clearly what their needs are, then that leads to some mental health issues that go on within them. One of the things when we talk about the other side of this, where men are, one of the things that's communicated to men is that they have to succeed at everything. They have to be wealthy, they have to be physically fit, they have to be really smart, they have to be a great husband, a great employee. And by the way, I know that ladies kind of receive similar messages too. So it's not just a man thing. Men hear that, and unless they have the disposition to do those, be able to do those things, then they fall short. And most men conclude that they are not good enough then. Because a standard has been set for them that either intentionally or unintentionally, it almost mostly happens unintentionally, meaning there's not somebody sitting above them, wagging their finger saying, you're not good enough, but they're taught to reach a certain standard. And when they fall short of that standard, then the men feel like they're not good enough. And so they're not good enough and they can't assert themselves. And so the result is some of the mental health needs that the men come in to see me with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the Podcourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I'm just reflecting on how things have changed in our culture. And I'm sure, I am Gen X, and growing up in I guess mainly the 80s, some of the messages that I got were stay small, avoid conflict. So it's interesting how that has shifted so much in our culture, because starting, I guess, probably late 90s, that really started to shift for women. And now it seems like we've flipped or switched sides for a lot of these things. So it's fascinating, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and what we tend to see on some of the sitcoms, I haven't watched TV for a long time, 20 years probably. And that's just personal choice of mine. But when I would watch sitcoms back in the 80s, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. And so as we moved through the 80s, my memory, and I remember hearing my father talk a lot about how most dads in some of these shows were made to look incompetent, foolish, and absolutely inappropriate. And we think about men from when I was growing up, like Archie Bunker, things like that they were so dramatically different from what most men are, that most men saw this and withdrawal. If you look at board games many times, like, maybe these are dating me a little bit, but games like Stratego, or, where there's a picture of a family on the front of the box, the dad was often the one losing and being a loser often, not just occasionally, often. So there were just messages sent. And again, whether it's intentional or not, that's beyond my knowledge.
Yeah.
But the message that really is sent is, men, you have to succeed at everything, but you can't say anything.
Yeah.
So you have to hide behind the shadows.
Okay. So how does that manifest into symptoms, you think? What do you see mostly?
Yeah, it's a great question. Mostly what I see is what we would call in the counseling field, cognitive dissonance, which is basically a person holds two competing ideas that both can't really be true at the same time. And then there's tension between these two ideas. And that tension, unless it's resolved, that tension leads to emotional dysregulation and whatnot. So what I see a lot in the men that come to see me is depression. I see a lot of anxiety. I see a lot of impulse control issues that really, really, from my view, leads to pornography use and sometimes addiction. I see men seeking out fulfillment from everybody else and everything else, and seeking affirmation from everybody else and everything else, and they're not getting it, because that's not really where you get the affirmation from everybody else and everything else. So men strive. So what I see is men striving to get that affirmation and fulfillment so that they feel good about themselves, but they don't ever really get it for any length of time. We see some of the other men, some of the data that we see, regarding suicide rates, for example. In England, there's some studies that indicate that, like 1 in 8 men, 75% of men in England, rather, 75% of the completed suicides are men. In the UK. In the US, the number is very similar. It's 77%. And sometimes the explanation is given that, well, men use more aggressive means to end their lives. And I think that accounts for some of it, for sure. But when you get to 3/4 of the completed suicides in our country or in the UK, and then that number is pretty similar across first world countries. When you get the numbers that high, it's more than just the aggressive means by which one attempts to take their life. Okay. And I'm of the opinion, one of the things I hope to be able to talk a little bit about is that men are really, really, really lonely, generally speaking, and they're seeking fulfillment from all these other things, and none of them are fulfilling them. And so then they choose to end their lives. Okay. And that's a very sad thing, of course, that we're trying to prevent, of course, and I know you're in the field, Lisa. So, our field is dominated by female counselors, female therapists. So men tend to be reluctant to come to counseling because they just share that really hard stuff with that lady is not where they really get the connection from. Again, so I want to qualify, a lot of ladies do great work in that, but for a man to sit with another male therapist, they get a lot more connection that way.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I do see that in my work too, because I work with a predominantly male population, and a lot of the times I'm referring to a male therapist
Right.
when it reaches a certain point in the work that I do. So I think that's really important to talk about. And I know there are some women therapists out there who do focus on working with men. Like, they've spent a lot of time and energy focusing on working with men. So I appreciate what you're saying about women can work with men. But
Absolutely.
if you're somebody listening to this episode because you might be a man struggling, you want to look for somebody who has more training than just your average therapist. I would recommend, because we do have people that listen to these shows that aren't, in the field, but they enjoy the information. So, all right. So where would you like to go next?
Yeah, well, let me finish up a little bit on some men's mental health needs. But I do want to talk about. I don't want to spend too much time here, because you've had at least one really great Podcourse. I'm going to mispronounce his name, Eddie Caparucci.
Eddie Caparucci.
Yeah, which really did. And I listened to it, and he did a phenomenal job in explaining pornography use and sexual addiction and those kinds of things. So I just want to touch on this, because there's, I wouldn't be able to do it as well as he did in just a few minutes. So what we see, when we talk about mental health needs and behavioral health needs, I see a lot of men who are dealing with sexually compulsive behaviors, whether that's be pornography use or compulsive masturbation, or buying sex through prostitution, or video sex stuff. When I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, pornography use was so rare because it was basically just magazines, and it wasn't super accessible for at least me growing up. And now it's so accessible that men turn to pornography and sex addiction because of the potential fulfillment, the pseudo fulfillment that they are seeking. They're seeking real fulfillment, but the pornography gives them a pseudo fulfillment or superficial fulfillment. And this is what a lot of the guys tell me, by the way. This isn't just me reading a book about it, Eddie Caparucci's book or another book. It is truly the guys are saying, I'm seeking something, and at least I find it temporarily here and watching this particular video. So I would say that of my caseload over the last 3 years working almost exclusively with men, is that over 50% of the men that I see really are struggling with compulsive sexual behaviors. That may not be the only thing. They generally don't come in saying, Steve, can you help me with compulsive sexual behaviors? They're asking about something else, and they almost inadvertently bring up that they're buying prostitutes or buying sex, or they're doing video sex or whatnot. But I see this a lot with the couples that come in. Even if they come in initially with some other need, they will eventually, it's not uncommon, more than 50% of the couples, one or both of them will then bring up that there's pornography, that pornography has, or compulsive sexual behaviors has affected the relationship. So that's really interesting. The research around this, Patrick Carnes and other people that are pretty well known in this field have estimated about 3 to 6% of men across the United States experience compulsive sexual behavior or addiction. And so the clinical sample, those that come into counseling, that number's north of 50% from my experience. That's pretty high.
Okay.
And so we're pretty concerned about that as counselors. So what does this all point to in men? Well, I think it points to this cognitive dissonance I mentioned earlier, and this tension that are inherent into men. Now I do have to say, I do want to qualify a little bit what I'm about to say by saying this, that like ladies, men, within the men group, there is a lot of variability related to the personality disposition of the male, just like there is with the ladies. So one of the things that I do not like that happens in our culture and happens in our field, and I'm probably guilty of this too, is placing people into these groups and then assuming certain characteristic of that group and then applying those characteristics to everybody within the group. And I think I understand why we do that, but I just don't know that it's really helpful for us to do that. I think what's helpful is to sit with the person and get to know them individually. Hopefully that's not a surprise to those of us that do counseling, that we need to get to know people individually, right?
Right.
But yeah. So I understand within the men, there are many different dispositions. Some men are more gentle, more feelings based, and all this is fine. All this is just, it is what it is. And some men are just naturally more assertive. Some people would say aggressive. I would not say that. Some people are more assertive. They're more willing to dig their heels in and stand for something that's really important to them. One of the guys that I'm friends with, he's a wonderful man, and he is really soft-hearted. He cries on a dime, and he is embarrassed by it, though, because the message from the culture is, from some circles in the culture, is, no, you got to be strong and you can't show any of your emotions. And every man I know, once they're seeing me in the office, will say, well, I've got to experience my emotions, right? That's part of it. Yes, you need to. You're not a robot, so you need to be able to share your emotions. And so my friend is his disposition is, he's very sensitive. He's emotionally soft and those kinds of things, but he's very much physically a man, right? He still wants to protect his family. He's married, has one child, and he very much is taking on this role as a father and as a husband. Whereas there's other men that I know that are, maybe more masculine and less in touch with their feelings and more intellectual, more cognitive, and maybe more physical. And so, of course, we see within men this wide range of people. So as I talk about this, I'm not trying to just put everybody into one basket here, but I think it's important for us as counselors, as mental health providers, to really consider that when we send these multiple messages to the men, you have to succeed at everything and you just need to be quiet. That causes this cognitive tension, cognitive dissonance in all the men, regardless of their disposition. So the soft-hearted man who's been told that, he's an engineer by training, so he's very much in his head and works by himself pretty much. He's not going to be the guy who's going to lead the charge down, if there's a battle. He's not going to be the guy that leads the charge. But the message is, everything you do, you have to succeed. And he is thinking, no, I just want to be who I am within my family and just live in alignment with my personality. And so the men who are more aggressive tend to hear, well, yeah, you can succeed at everything, but you just have to be quiet about it. Don't speak up. As you said, Lisa, growing up in the 80s, like 80s into the 90s, women, or 70s and 80s, women were taught to be really small. And that there has been this reversal, I believe, where a lot of the men talk about they've been told to be quiet. And if they want to assume a role within their family as a leader, as a protector, as a provider, many men are told, well, no, that's not really just your role. You need to be quiet and not assert yourself. And that creates a lot of distress in them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we think about, as counselors, we think about how to help men. And this isn't just counselors, by the way. This is just our culture. This is just being a human. This is for any other man that might be listening, or either any lady that's listening to this. There is room for all of us to build a solid, helpful relationships with men. Lisa, the number of men who come into my office over the years, who, once we've built the counseling rapport, we have the relationship, and where we've done the assessment, we do treatment planning and whatnot, we kind of get rolling in counseling. The number of men who, when they get comfortable with me, will say to me sheepishly, almost apologetically, Steve, you're the only guy that I have ever known that I could talk to. And I think what they mean by that is, you're the only guy that I'm going to talk to, or that I have talked to, that I can talk to, who doesn't just tell me to suck it up, grow a spine. And sometimes that needs to be said, or things like that need to be said. But you're the only guy that I've talked to that isn't judgmental, isn't looking down his nose at me, you just give me room to talk. And I see that in the counseling office. I am part of a men's I get to lead a men's ministry within the church I attend, and we have a weekly Wednesday night small group of men. We're 25 men of a church of about 400 come to this thing. They give up their Wednesday night to just be with a group of men who, we've kind of created this atmosphere. It's almost like it's not really group therapy, but it's almost this environment where the guys can come in and talk, and we have certain ground rules about what we talk about in the room stays in the room, and we care for each other. We connect with each other. We fight for each other in a sense of support. And the number of men who will give up their Wednesday night to do that is astounding. And the men that come to that will say to me and say to the rest of the men too, like, this is the only place that I can come and share my heart, tell about my struggles, and try to have other men help me to live in alignment with what my personality disposition is and what I feel like my purpose in life is. So one of the things I'm absolutely convinced of, and more convinced of it the more I do therapy and the more I just do the work that I do, is that we, counselors, whoever else, have to first acknowledge our own biases of what men, quote, men should be, unquote. That we just allow men to be men. We allow men to be human beings. Surprise, surprise. We allow men to be human beings, and we just build good relationships with them. So that is often a first step to help men. Of course, for counselors, that's kind of a basic. Hopefully, it's kind of a basic thing. I'm just going to this person's going to come in, male or female, and I'm just going to build a connection with them in as non-judgmental a way as possible. And so I also find in counseling that when men can build safe relationships with other men, in other words, attachment. So we know about attachment theory in our field. And so when men can have a secure attachment with another man, older or even surprisingly younger, that men's emotions begin to regulate and stabilize. I think that's true for ladies too, of course. We're talking specifically about men, that men's emotions might be dysregulated, maybe bouncing up and down in life, have a lot of anxiety or a lot of depression. But when they can have a connection with another man or men that's healthy and they're attached, then that tends to regulate the emotions for the man. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so we want to build healthy relationships with men. So we want to acknowledge our biases right out of the gate of what a man should be. I have to do that. I'm working with a young man right now and I'm admittedly a little struggling with this particular case. A young man is 27 and did not grow up with a father. He is unmotivated. He wants everybody else to take care of him. And I'm working with him, trying to help him get motivated, trying to help him move forward with his growth and just grown as a man, if you will. And he's very emotionally dysregulated. Again, grew up in a fatherless home, and his mom did a great job raising him. But a young man needs an older man, and I have to check my own biases at the door, thinking, okay, I need you to be like me. This is what a man is. This is what I am. And I have to check myself, check my biases right at the door to say, no, it's not about making him be like me. I don't want to create him in my image. I just want him to grow in alignment with his personality dispositions. Okay. And live in alignment with his purpose. So we have to really set aside our biases and try to build relationships.
Checking our own biases at the door can be difficult for, a lot of us. Is there anything, I'm just curious, is there anything that you do to kind of ground yourself before you go into a session with him, knowing that this might be, harder for you, this issue, this client?
Yeah. What I do is, that's a great question. Because I think about it with other people as well, that I just have a natural bias. I think we all do. I think we all have to be honest to say, hey, of course, I have my own value system, I have my own biases and whatnot. And so the first step is to recognize it. I have to know what it is. I have to know that I'm biased and thinking or have concluded that, hey, this is what every man needs to be like. That's kind of a default in me, and I recognize that. And so the first step I do is I recognize. The second thing is I conclude that I'm not the answer to every man's dilemma, right? I don't have all the answers. And I teach at CIU, as I'm teaching master's students about counseling, one of the questions they'll often ask me is, Dr. Stuhlreyer, when I don't know what to say, if a client brings something to me and I don't know what to say, what do I do? And my pat answer is, well, don't say anything. Like, don't just make it up, and, if you have some evidence, research-based information, yeah, I'll try to offer some of that. It's okay to say, man, I really don't know the answer to that. What do you think about it? Johnny or Sally or whoever the client is. And so I tend to take that approach is when I, with him in particular, when I don't know where to go with him, and I know that my bias might drag me, try to pull him where I want him to go. When I sense that and I don't know where to go with him, I'll just ask him, hey, what do you think? What do you think about this particular situation, and what decisions do you think you should make? Let's dialogue about that a little bit. Right.
That's helpful. Is there something that you do differently with men, or something that you find that works really well when it comes to getting started or identifying treatment goals or the treatment plan?
Yeah. I'm not sure how different this would be than I would with a lady, but I would say that I'm really intentional with most men. Again, I'm trying to develop a treatment plan with them and treatment goals with them. That's in alignment with their personality disposition, among other things. That's one. Their personality disposition is an ingredient that is in my head that I'll share with them too. Us developing and wording, I will tend to use treatment goals that are much more action oriented, and even they'll have action oriented words in them, and or have some goals that will maybe be more about learning information. Again, depending on their personality disposition. Somebody who's maybe more soft hearted, we may make some treatment goals around emotional regulation or whatnot as a primary focus. Whereas whereas some of the men are more assertive, I want to give them action-oriented issues to focus on. And so that might be the primary difference with the men.
Yeah, I can understand that. I know that my husband likes to be given an action, like a to-do, or tell me how I can fix this, or how can I problem solve, or so I can understand just knowing him and knowing how he operates. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. So we acknowledge our own biases. We build we build relationships, good attachments, which means we're present with the person all the time as much as we can be, as therapists. We're non-judgmental. If a client asks me my opinion on something, I generally am reluctant to share my opinion on something. On occasion, they'll push so hard to ask me, well, Steve, what do you think? Tell me what you think. And so I will respond to that, of course, and typically qualify that by saying, now I'm just giving my opinion on, and we're not talking political or religious things. We're talking about, give me your opinion on, Steve, on how I communicate to my wife that I don't like it when she, goes outside to smoke a cigarette. I don't like smoking. How do I communicate that? And so I will qualify by saying, look, this is just my opinion. Let me tell you what I would think, and let's work together on maybe structuring a way to communicate this in such a way that you build attachment with her. I'm trying to communicate to a man in a way that he's going to hear it. Right. Hopefully that makes sense. That should be in my opinion, kind of a duh moment for everybody. Of course, you want to communicate in such a way that the other person hears it. But, and with men in particular, the way I try to communicate is through, again, depending on their disposition, try to communicate to their mind first. Like, here's some action steps you could do. And based on research and experience, say, if you do these action steps, your emotions are probably going to regulate more. I'll give you an example. Again, working a lot with men around pornography, but especially when the men are acknowledging, I'm really seeking this quote unquote relationship with these videos, these women on these videos and the pornography. I'm really seeking that out because I need non-judgmental fulfillment. And we know, and I think Eddie Caparucci said this, or something like this, that really pornography use really is not about sexual pleasure. It's about connection and even pseudo attachment. And so we'll talk, the guys will say, I'm really seeking this out. That's the fulfillment piece I'm trying to seek out. Well, so instead of trying to address that directly, many times if I can address with the men, well, would you rather be attached to your wife? Would you rather have fulfillment through her? Again, not just sexual fulfillment, but just relational fulfillment. Would you rather have it with her? And most men will say, absolutely. Okay, then let's focus, let's put our initial focus on how do you connect to your wife? Let's learn about ladies in general. What's your wife's personality like? Et cetera, and learning to teach the man how to communicate to his spouse or other people, and maybe some other cases, in a way that they're going to hear it. So the action steps for the men actually help regulate their emotions. So I'm kind of indirectly trying to get to their emotional dysregulation through their behaviors.
Yeah, makes sense. I like it.
Yeah. And probably the last big general area I work with men in general, again, see this around pornography or compulsive sexual use or none of those things, are the men. What I want to do is with the man, try to get to the core of his struggles, right? Get down to the core beliefs, what in the cognitive behavioral theory world, we call it core beliefs. I think what's really helpful, a guy named John Eldredge wrote a book called Wild at Heart years ago, I think in the late 90s, around 2000. And he and his wife wrote the book Captivated for ladies, I think. And basically the focus of the book, Wild at Heart, was getting to the center of the heart of the man. And so John Eldredge, instead of using the term core belief, he uses the term agreement, which in my opinion, is much more helpful. When I talk about core beliefs to men and ladies, when I've seen them, there's some confusion around, what do you mean by core beliefs? My spiritual religious beliefs? Because that's the connection people make. And so I have to clear that up. So I will often use the term agreement, that men tend to agree to certain things. And their agreement might be like, see, I'm not good enough. Probably the most common agreement or core belief that I hear from men is that I'm not enough. And so can you imagine living under this umbrella of belief, a shame statement, which is I am not enough. By the way, I'm aware the ladies experience very similar things, and their agreements are maybe a little different, generally speaking. And so I think everybody can relate to this. But surprisingly, especially the men who tend to be more outward and more assertive, still believe in many cases some form of I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not successful enough. I'm not fill in the blank enough. And so I really, when I'm working with men, work really hard to get to that issue of, okay, let's talk about what this really means. When you're saying I'm not enough, what you're saying is I'm defining everything about who I am. Like, I am this thing. Like, I can say to you with confidence, Lisa, that I'm a father. I have 3 kids. That's part of my identity. I'm a husband of 25 years. That's part of my identity. When men and women say, I'm not enough, that's part of their identity. I am this thing. And I think Brene Brown and others talk about the same statements, and she's right on about this, and others have written about this, that if, when we define ourselves in a certain way, we tend to begin to live in alignment with that. Right. So it's a very common agreement or core belief in men. The core of their struggles is I'm not enough. So we talk about, okay, what do you mean? Well, let me help you understand what you're doing here. I am this thing. You're building this basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. You now are going to start living in alignment with this thing, or you have been rather. We also then focus on the word enough. Like this is kind of a cognitive approach that I talk with the guys about. Well, let's talk about enough. The word enough implies a standard. I'm not enough compared to what or whom? I had a guy in my office years ago, probably 6-7 years ago, who was is a pastor on staff at a church locally. And he was going through some struggles and whatever, and the marriage was kind of struggling. And when you're a pastor and your marriage is struggling, that's a biggie. A lot of pastors feel like they live in a glass bowl. And so as we were talking, he said to me, I'm not a good enough husband. I said, what are you talking about? Not good enough. Just wanted to get into define it. So what's this enough? He said, well, I'd only be enough if I was perfect. And he's a smart guy, right? He was a smart guy. So as soon as that came out of his mouth, he knew what I was going to say because he's a smart guy. And we had conversations like this previous. He said, I know, I'm not perfect. I said, well, do you know any couples that are perfect? He said, well, and he named 6 couples by name, person, just husband's name, wife's name. What he didn't know, and I didn't tell him, was one of those couples had been in to see me a year before, or what, it just coincidentally just happened to be that way. And they were a really good couple, but they weren't perfect. Right. So we live in that, the men will often live in that tension. I'm not enough. And when you get to the enough part, we start talking about, well, what's the standard you're trying to live up to? And I see this in my own life, kind of grown up and had a conversion in my late 20s to Christianity. And so before then, certainly I was like, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. And if you would have asked me, compared to what, Steve, I would have said, I have no idea. And so I find that a lot of men, they either don't know what that standard is because they've never given any thought to it. Like me, that was me, of course. Or that they do have the standard, like the guy I just mentioned, but the standard's so high that there's no way they're going to achieve it. Because imagine if you had a standard of perfection, what's the likelihood that you're going to have a minute of perfection, right? Always living under the I'm not enough. And so I work hard to get to the core at the center of the man, which is they may word it differently, but really the theme is I'm not enough. And we start working on changing that standard to something that's realistic rather than it either being undefined or it's so ridiculously high, you're never going to achieve it. We start bringing it to a place where, okay, now you can maybe assess yourself against the realistic standard. So maybe they can have some success. And we start to, what I call unglobalize the I am part of it. Try to work against the I am this global thing. I'm not good enough to, well, you know what? Maybe I wasn't good enough in this particular situation, but that doesn't define who I am globally. And so that's the process I work with men, is building the relationships with them, getting strong attachment, give them a place to really talk to me about, and then get to the core of their struggles. And I do a lot of get to the core of the struggles through some homework assignments and through a specific movie that I ask them to watch and do some reading and whatnot. That's what they lean towards.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're using CBT, you're using attachment theory, guessing you're using some like motivational interviewing. Is there anything, am I missing anything that you're kind of tapping into?
Yeah, I use, certainly a pull from narrative therapy,
Okay.
which is, what's the story you tell yourself, basically. And this is where my homework assignments, specifically a particular movie, I want them to get into the story. But the movie is called The Kid. It's kind of a hokey 1997 movie from Disney. It seems like it starts off pretty hokey, but then you watch it and it's really profound, in my opinion. And so the guys watch it. I try to get them into to the story that has been in their head, that develops this core belief and that sustains that core belief of I'm not enough.
Are there any, I guess, issues that men present with that you find to be typically harder to work with, or over the different things you mentioned, like depression, anxiety, pornography, sex addiction? What's probably the harder of the group?
Yeah, I think probably what's hardest is related to compulsive sexual behavior. Is what I mean. Primarily, kind of a subset of that group would be men who've been unfaithful to their wives, and they now they and their spouse are in the office and trying to work through this infidelity. Of course, there's so many components to trying to work through that. And one of the components related specifically to men is that in the case where the man's been unfaithful sexually, the lady rightly has been hurt and offended, and she's angry, and she is effectively trying to tell her husband, he's the problem, and if he would just get this fixed, we'll be okay. And so, I try to generally approach that by saying, yes, you're responsible. But the way to heal this relationship is the attachment between the two of you. And so trying to help the regulation of both members of the couple, but primarily with the guy, as we're in this settings, and as the woman that he's married to that he loves is attacking him, and she has the right to be assertive and say what she needs to say, but getting him to be able to process and think through what she's saying in a less defensive manner. That's what I find to be really difficult. And in those cases, it's really work with both members of that couple to help him to hear what she's saying and not reinforce this I'm not good enough core belief, and help her be able to be assertive and communicate clearly how he hurt her, rightly so, but do it in such a way that isn't really intentionally leading him to be more defensive.
Right. Yeah. Couples are, it's going to be tough.
Oh yeah. And I do find the John and Julie Gottman work, research and writings around this to be really, really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that's really good work. So is there anything else that we want to cover or you'd like to share?
I think that's about it, what I have for today. I will say, I think my experience is that men really want relationships with other men. And again, whether that's a male therapist or getting involved in a men's group of some kind or some way, that will go a long way to improve men's mental health.
Okay, great. Would you recommend therapists out there who work with men to possibly do groups? Would that be a suggestion?
Yeah, that'd be a great suggestion for here locally where I live at. There's one men's group outside the one that I'm a part of, and it is part of another church in which the men get together, and it's pretty well attended. But there are many, many therapists who do men's groups. But if a man, even the other day, one of my couples, the wife walked out frustrated, and he said to me, exasperated, Steve, is there any kind of men's group that you can refer me to? And I know one, but I lead it. And so I don't want to refer him to that, be a conflict of interest. But there's a dearth of these kinds of men's groups around.
Okay. Well, I think this has been great information. Where can those listening find find out more about you? Do you have a website?
Yeah, go to a website. It's Rooted Mind LLC, or rootedmind.org.net. I'm sorry, rootedmind.net is the website. And that will get you to the website for my private practice. But they can also email me at my CIU email address. It's steve.stuhlreyer@ciu.edu.
And I'll put that in the show notes, you guys. So don't worry about having to spell it out. So just look to the show notes for all these links. And if you purchase the Podcourse, you will have access to a short PowerPoint presentation that Steve has put together, as well as the resources and references that he has pulled this information from. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Please note that the Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and not a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice. Always consult with your therapist, doctor, or physician before implementing any suggestions from the show. The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard is edited and engineered by Chelsea Weaver. If you're looking to start a podcast or ready to take the editing off of your plate, be sure to visit chelseaweaverpodcasting.com. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. I know there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and I'm thankful you've chosen to listen to mine. Be sure to visit lisamustard.com to access the show notes and discover all the Podcourses and other continuing education offerings. And I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the show. Thank you.